Rhyme Storytime. Little Bo-Peep by Helen Cromarty.
It was such a lovely day that little Bo-Peep decided to take her 2 sheep, Eunice and Rambo, up onto the hillside so they'd have some fresh green grass to chew. She put on her bonnet, picked up her crook and went out into the yard to the pen where they were kept. Eunice and Rambo, who were 2 rather fat, lazy sheep, sighed on seeing Bo-Peep coming towards them. She looked unpleasantly cheerful and full of energy. They'd only just woken up, and despite the fact they were hungry, they were very warm and comfortable. "I wish we could explain to Bo-Peep," grumbled Rambo, "that if she'd just bring some tasty clumps of grass to us in here, we'd be quite happy." "Then we wouldn't have to move," agreed Eunice. Bo-Peep, quite unaware of how reluctant Eunice and Rambo were to go and find some juicy grass, breezed into the pen. "Come on, lazy bones," she said brightly. "Time for a little walk." Both Eunice and Rambo groaned and struggled to their feet, bleating pitifully. Once out of the pen, tails wagging, the 2 sheep trotted over to where the grass was growing just under the wall at the far end of the farmyard and began pulling at it furiously. "No, no," laughed Bo-Peep. "We're going up the hill. Go on with you, through the gate." "Up the hill?" grumbled Eunice. "That's no laughing matter." Nevertheless, she went through the gate, taking a quick nibble at the grass here and there as she went. Rambo, deciding on another delaying tactic, tried to squeeze through the fence. "Rambo!" called his mistress. "Not that field, silly boy. Up the hill. Go on now." She gave the reluctant Rambo a little shove, and bleating just to emphasize his displeasure, he went through the gate after Eunice, his tail wagging furiously behind him. Out in the lane they both tried to scamper down the hill. Bo-Peep ran after them and had to use her crook to bring them back. Having turned each of the sheep round, she spoke to them quite sharply, pushing them along to get them to go up in the right direction. At last the 2 sheep were trotting up the lane, but poor Bo-Peep had to urge them on every minute or 2, as, grinning secretly to each other, Eunice and Rambo found interesting bits of grass to investigate in the hedgerow. They were being very naughty. Suddenly, a horse in the field on the other side of the hedge startled them, and they began to run, bumping against one another and squabbling furiously. "Out of my way!" yelled Rambo, giving his sister a shove. "No, you get out of the way!" she responded, equally rudely, pushing him back. Then they saw a gap under the opposite hedge, and both of them tried to squeeze through it, pretending to be afraid of the horse. In actual fact, they saw that particular horse every morning on their way to and from the farm, as the far end of the field began just opposite the farmyard gate. Bo-Peep sighed. Rambo and Eunice were determined to be difficult. "No, no, no," she said, now quite exasperated. "You're just being ridiculous. Come out of there. It's not big enough for 2 of you at once. You'll get stuck." First she put her crook around Rambo's neck and gently pulled him out, and then she did the same to Eunice. They were both very indignant, and went scampering off up the lane, their tails wagging behind them in annoyance. At the crossroads at the top of the lane, they paused. "I'm exhausted," complained Eunice. "And I can't walk another step," added Rambo. "I'm going to have to eat something before I collapse from exhaustion." He looked around, and on seeing a particularly green patch of grass on the opposite hedgerow, padded over and determinedly began to chew at it. "It's very warm," sighed Bo-Peep, wiping her hand across her brow. "Warm?" bleated Eunice. "She should try walking up that hill in a woolly coat. I'm roasting." And she too went to join Rambo, where the grass looked particularly green and tasty. Just then they heard the sound of someone humming a cheerful tune. Bo-Peep and the 2 sheep looked up, and there, coming down from the opposite direction, was Mrs. Tomlinson. Bo-Peep bit her lip and tried not to sigh. She liked Mrs. Tomlinson, but she was a bit of a chatterbox. Her eyes lit up when she saw Bo-Peep, and she hurried over to speak to her. She was anxious to tell her how well the chickens were laying, and then to send a message to Bo-Peep's mother, as they were very good friends. "Tell her I've just finished my patchwork quilt," she said proudly, "so perhaps your mother would like to come up and see how well it looks. I'm very pleased with the result, even though I say so myself." "Oh, I'm sure she'd love to come," responded Bo-Peep politely, and then they stood talking about what had been going on in the village. On seeing Mrs. Tomlinson and their mistress deep in conversation, Eunice frowned. "There was some mention of juicy green grass," she complained. "There was," agreed Rambo, nodding his head. "I think she's forgotten all about us." An interesting thought crossed Eunice's mind, and she grinned mischievously. "Do you know," she whispered, "if we slipped quietly away, I have an idea that Bo-Peep wouldn't even notice." Rambo grinned and peered round to look at where their mistress was still chatting to Mrs. Tomlinson. "I don't think she would." His grin broadened. "I noticed some rather particularly interesting grass on the other side of the hedge. You know, the one with the hole in it, just down the lane." Eunice smiled. "Oh, yes, I remember." Cautiously they glanced up again, but it was all right. Bo-Peep was still busy talking and not even looking at them. Quietly, moving very slowly so they wouldn't be noticed, they edged their way back down the lane. When they reached the hole, excitedly, first Eunice and then Rambo squeezed their way through. The grass looked wonderful and it tasted delicious. This was much better than waiting around at the top of the lane until Bo-Peep was ready to pay them some attention. It was almost an hour later that they heard voices, and quickly they hid behind a particularly thick part of the hedge. "Eunice! Rambo! Where are you?" called Bo-Peep as she peered through the hole. The naughty sheep stood very still. Poor Bo-Peep couldn't see them and moved sadly away. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Tomlinson, "they're nowhere to be seen." She patted the worried little girl's arm. "Don't be upset. I'm sure they'll come home when they're ready, tails wagging behind them as they always do." Bo-Peep sniffed. "I suppose so." "You go home. They might be back already," Mrs. Tomlinson said kindly. Bo-Peep nodded, and having said goodbye, set off slowly back down the lane towards the farm. When they'd gone, Eunice and Rambo chortled with delight. I'm sorry to say they thought they'd been very clever and were extremely pleased with themselves. "Next time," he said unkindly, "perhaps Bo-Peep will look after us instead of talking to Mrs. Tomlinson." "Exactly," agreed Eunice. Suddenly there was a snort. "And what," demanded a deep voice, "are you two silly animals doing in my field?" The two bad sheep spun round startled and then shrank back with fear. They gazed up in horror, for there, standing frowning angrily down at them, was an enormous brown bull. Eunice gulped. "Your field?" she mumbled. "My field," agreed the bull. "I was over on the far side when what should I see but you two rude sheep squeezing your way in through the hedge." "I'm sorry, we didn't know it was your field," stuttered Rambo. "Well, now you do, so you will oblige me by squeezing your way back out." "No!" bellowed the bull. Without arguing, the naughty sheep turned on their tails and fled. Rambo's feet hardly touched the ground as he dashed for the hole in the hedge. He pushed his way through as fast as he could, leaving Eunice to follow. Then together they ran down the lane and back into the farmyard, their tails wagging behind them. Bo-Peep had been standing in the farmhouse doorway, still watching out for her two sheep. When she saw them come through the open gate, she ran across the yard to greet them, stooping to give each a hug in turn. Rambo and Eunice exchanged a knowing glance. "I think," said Rambo haughtily, "that Bo-Peep has missed us." Eunice nodded in agreement. "I think she has." And they smiled at each other, both very relieved to be home. It would be a long time before they would run away and hide again.
Nursery Rhyme Story Time. Diddle Diddle Dumpling, My Son John, by Helen Cromarty.
The cockerel crowed, and young John Dumpling woke with a start. He rubbed his eyes, pushed back the bedclothes, and leapt out of bed. Then he ran to the window and threw open the curtains, letting the sunshine pour in. John smiled a wide, beaming smile. The sky was so clear and blue, the sun so bright and warm, that he knew it would be a fine sunny day. And for the very first time he was going with his father to the fields to help gather in the hay. He was so excited he danced around his bedroom, singing at the top of his voice. Quickly John washed and dressed, and he was soon ready and running down the stairs. When he entered the kitchen, his mother, who was busy at the stove, looked up with a smile. He skipped across the floor to her, and she caught him in her arms. "Good morning," she said, and gave him a great big hug and a kiss. "You look like a bouncing ray of sunshine. Don't get too excited, or you'll have no energy left to help with the hay." Mrs. Dumpling sat John down at the table and gave him a mug of milk. "Breakfast won't be long," she said. John frowned worriedly. He was afraid he was going to be too excited to eat, and he knew his mother wouldn't let him leave the table until he finished all his breakfast. And he didn't want to miss going to gather hay with his father. Just then there was the noise of feet on the cobblestones, and the cheerful sound of someone whistling. There was the whooshing noise of the pump, as out in the yard someone had a good wash. Then at last the door opened, and there was Mr. Dumpling with their dog Gruff. His father had been out in the cowshed milking the cows. Now he was ready for his breakfast. "Hello, my son," he said, laughing as John scrambled down from the table and ran to hug his daddy. "Are you all ready for a long day's work?" "Oh, yes," cried John, tugging at his father's hand. "Come and have breakfast, and then we can go." When they'd all eaten, John was allowed down from the table, and he went to find his strong leather shoes. He pulled them on, then quickly and carefully he set about tying the laces. John was very proud of being able to tie a good knot. He'd been practising again and again, as this was to be part of his job when he went to help gather in the hay. As soon as his laces were tied, he stood by the door waiting for his father, who'd gone to find them both a hat. "This will keep you cool," said his father, tugging a cloth hat down on John's head. It was a little too big, as it went down onto his forehead, but it had a small brim which would keep off the sun when they were out in the fields. John kissed his mother good-bye, and she stood at the door to watch them go. Mrs. Dumpling would be coming up to the fields a little later on, as, at haymaking time, everyone helped. With Gruff at their heels, John and his father set off across the yard and went into the barn. Inside it was quite dark. Mr. Dumpling unhooked his large rake from up on the wall, and they set off again, out into the sunshine, across the yard, through the gate to the meadow, towards the top field where the tall grass was growing. As they got nearer, they could see there were people already there. Rows of men were mowing the grass with scythes. A scythe is a curved kind of knife, with a very long handle, so that you don't have to bend very far when you're busy swishing it to and fro to cut down the tall grasses. It was used in the days long ago, when there were no cutting machines, like combine harvesters, which now make haymaking so much quicker. Behind the men mowing were men and women raking up the cut grass into small piles, and beside them were children making bundles by tying a long piece of grass around a small pile and making it secure with a very firm knot. John couldn't wait to try. He jumped up and down excitedly, but he had to stop as his hat slipped down over his eyes and he couldn't see. People called a friendly greeting to them as they entered the field, and some of the children paused to wave to John as he passed by, wading through the grass. It was almost as tall as John, so he could just see over the top, and all that could be seen of Gruff was the black tip of his tail moving through the grass ahead. They made their way over to where their neighbour George was waiting for them with his scythe. "Hello, John," said George. "All ready for a hard day's work?" "Oh, yes," he replied eagerly, and his father and George laughed as he began to jump up and down again, and his hat fell over his eyes. Well, it was a very hard day's work. George would take hold of the grass in his large hand, with his scythe very skilfully cut it down. Mr. Dumpling would rake the cut grass into small neat piles. Then John would take a long piece of grass, wrap it round one of the piles, and secure it with a knot, making each pile into a neat bundle. By the time Mrs. Dumpling came to join them, John was very hot, and although he wouldn't admit it, quite tired. Mrs. Dumpling had brought a basket of provisions, and so they all sat down to take a rest while they had something to eat and drink. Gruff, who had been busy supervising from a safe distance, came to join them. His tongue hung down as he panted from the heat. It was exhausting watching people work. The sun was warm, and all the workers were hot and sticky from their haymaking. It was hard work, but it was fun. John felt very grown up and very tired. When they set to work again, Mrs. Dumpling stayed to help John. It was easier and quicker with the two of them, and by dinner-time they'd made a long line of bundles. Mrs. Dumpling had brought plenty of freshly baked bread, delicious yellow cheese, and some little fruit pies. They all had a wonderful picnic, and then there was time for John to have a good game of hide-and-seek with the other children. They burrowed down amongst the stacks of grass bundles, and in and around the hedges. Gruff joined in too, but he was so pleased when he discovered where John was hiding that he always barked with delight and gave away his hiding place. Silly Gruff. After dinner they set to work once more, and every now and again John stopped to get his breath back and to watch the men stacking the bundles up into little haystacks. As the sun sank low in the sky, the haymakers began to gather up their belongings. How different the fields looked now! Gone was the tall green spraying grass, and in its place the floor of the fields were covered with short little stubbles of grass. Dotted here and there, the bundles which John had helped to tie were standing on end, propped up against one another to make neat haystacks. They would be left standing for many days until the green of the grass had faded and turned to a pale yellow and become hay. Then the hay would be taken down to the farm to be stored in the barns, ready to feed the animals during the long cold winter. But that was another day. Everyone was tired as they made their way slowly down to the big farmhouse, but not too tired, for the farmer, Mr. Giles, had laid on a feast for all the haymakers. There was singing and dancing, and to John's delight, plenty to eat and drink. As the sky darkened and evening came, young John found he couldn't stop yawning, and he was having difficulty in keeping his eyes open. "Time for bed," said his father kindly, and he hoisted John up onto his shoulders. Mrs. Dumpling, with Mr. Dumpling carrying their sleepy son, walked home in the warm evening air. As soon as they reached the cottage, Mr. Dumpling washed John's hands and face. "Up to bed you go," he said, "and a good bath for you in the morning." He nodded drowsily as he set off up the stairs. Poor John could hardly lift his head. He sat on the edge of his bed and struggled to undo his laces. He managed to untangle them and to pull off one shoe. He felt so tired. "I'll just lie back a moment," he murmured, "and then I'll get undressed." A little while later, his mother tiptoed softly in. She stood at the foot of his bed and smiled. There was her son John, with his trousers, stockings, and one shoe still on. Gently she eased off the other shoe and put it on the floor beside the other one. Young John hardly stirred. His mother pulled the covers over him and left him to sleep. Undressing, bathing, everything could wait until the morning. In his sleep, John smiled contentedly. It had been a wonderful day.